Hello, I am Ajay Kumar. Welcome to the new episode of my channel Behind Your Behavior. Today we are going to discuss the story behind the discovery of classical conditioning, a learning theory by Ivan Pavlov. Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen by accident. That is exactly what happened to the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Let us see how a digestive experiment changed psychology forever. Pavlov, born on September 26, 1849, in Ryazan, Russia. His father was a Russian Orthodox priest, and Pavlov was expected to join the clergy. Instead, after reading scientific works, he chose to study natural science and medicine. In 1904, Pavlov received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his groundbreaking research on the physiology of digestion. This recognition came before he became famous for classical conditioning. It was the late 1890s in St. Petersburg, Russia. Ivan Pavlov was not trying to study learning or behavior. He was studying something much simpler. How does the digestive system work? His laboratory was filled with dogs, but these were not ordinary observations. Pavlov wanted to measure exactly how much saliva a dog produced when it ate. So he carefully designed an experiment. A small tube was surgically attached to a dog's salivary gland. Whenever saliva was produced, it flowed into a measuring tube. Now he could accurately measure every drop. His question was simple: how does food stimulate digestion? Every day, an assistant brought food to the dogs, as expected. When the food was placed before them, the dogs salivated. Food naturally causes salivation because the body prepares for digestion. Pavlov recorded the amount of saliva. Everything seemed routine. One morning, Pavlov noticed something strange. The dog started salivating before the food arrived. The food wasn't even in the room. Only the laboratory assistant was walking toward the dog. Another day, the dog salivated simply after hearing the assistant's footsteps. Another time, just seeing the white lab coat made the dog drool. Pavlov stopped writing. He looked at the dog and wondered, why is the dog salivating without food? Pavlov realized that the dog had learned something. The dog had associated the assistant with food. It was expecting food even before it arrived. Pavlov thought, if the dog can learn this association accidentally, can I teach it deliberately? And here, a new experiment began: classical conditioning. A Nobel Prize winning physiologist whose research on digestion unexpectedly transformed the field of psychology. The setting for the experiment was almost similar to his previous experiment on digestion. Procedure: Pavlov placed the dog inside a specialized soundproof chamber to eliminate external distractions, visual cues, or odors that could contaminate the trial. The dog was placed in a loose harness to keep it standing in front of an automated feeding trough. To objectively measure saliva, Pavlov surgically attached a small glass cannula directly to the duct of the dog's parotid salivary gland, routing the saliva outside the cheek into a graduated glass measuring tube. Observation: the dog remained calm inside the harness, establishing a baseline state with zero spontaneous salivation when no stimuli were present. Testing the unconditioned stimulus, UCS. Pavlov delivered meat powder directly into the dog's mouth using a remote delivery apparatus. He observed an innate reflex. The dog immediately salivated profusely upon contact with the food. Pavlov recorded this automatic, unlearned reaction as the unconditioned response, UCR, to the unconditioned stimulus, UCS. Testing the neutral stimulus, NS. Procedure: Pavlov sounded an auditory stimulus, such as a metronome ticking at a specific frequency, for example, 100 beats per minute, without presenting any food. Pavlov observed orienting reflex only. The dog turned its head toward the sound and perked its ears, but zero drops of saliva were produced. This confirmed that the metronome was a completely neutral stimulus, NS. The conditioning acquisition procedure. Let us see how Pavlov associated a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, that is, metronome with meat powder. Procedure. Pavlov started the metronome ticking, NS. Exactly 1 to 5 seconds later, while the metronome was still sounding, he introduced the meat powder, UCS, into the dog's mouth. Observation. The dog salivated in response to the taste of the food. Procedure. Pavlov systematically repeated this exact sequence, NS plus UCS, across dozens of trials over several consecutive days. Observation. Over repeated pairings, Pavlov observed that the onset of salivation began shifting earlier and earlier in time, starting before the food actually touched the dog's tongue. Testing the conditioned response after conditioning. Pavlov tested the association after conditioning. Pavlov activated the metronome NS completely by itself, deliberately withholding the meat powder. The moment the metronome began ticking, saliva began dripping down the glass tube at a steady rate long before any food appeared. Now, the neutral metronome had transformed into a conditioned stimulus, CS, and the anticipatory salivation to the sound alone was recorded as the conditioned response, CR. Testing. Extinction of learned behavior. Once the baseline association was established, Pavlov manipulated variables to observe how the nervous system managed learned signals. Pavlov repeatedly sounded the metronome CS every few minutes without ever reinforcing it with food, UCS. Drops of saliva decreased progressively trial by trial. For example, 10 drops on trial 1, 5 drops on trial 3, 1 drop on trial 6, until salivation ceased entirely. Pavlov termed this decay extinction. Testing spontaneous recovery. After extinguishing the response, Pavlov unharnessed the dog and gave it a 20-minute rest period. He then returned the dog to the apparatus and sounded the metronome CS once more without food. Without any new training, the dog immediately produced a moderate flow of saliva. This proved to Pavlov that extinction does not erase the original memory trace, but rather installs an active inhibitory signal. Let us see the definition of terms once again. Unconditioned stimulus, US, something that naturally triggers a response. So, for example, food, unconditioned response, UR, the natural unlearned reaction. For example, salivating to food. Conditioned stimulus, a CS, a neutral stimulus that, after association, triggers a response. So, for example, a metronome, conditioned response, CR, the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. For example, salivating to the bell. The key principles of classical conditioning. Acquisition, the initial stage when the link between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is established. Extinction, if the bell is rung repeatedly without food being presented, the salivation response eventually weakens and disappears. Spontaneous recovery, after a break, the conditioned response can suddenly reappear when the bell is rung again. Generalization, the tendency for a subject to respond to stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. For example, a dog salivating to a buzzer instead of a bell. Classical conditioning is not just a quirk of animal behavior, it is a primary driver behind how several psychological disorders develop and persist in human. Pavlov demonstrated that a biological response could be triggered by a previously neutral stimulus through repeated pairing. Classical conditioning provides powerful structural explanations for both adaptive behaviors and clinical psychopathologies. We will discuss these matters in upcoming episodes. For upcoming videos, please like and subscribe my channel. Thank you.